The night air was cool as Jamila Washington drove through the quiet streets of her neighborhood. Streetlights cast long shadows across her tired face. It had been a long day. First her job at the community center, then the neighborhood watch meeting that ran late. All she wanted now was to get home to her 2 children who were being watched by her mother. The red and blue lights flashed in her rearview mirror without warning. Jamila checked her speed. She was going exactly at the limit. She signaled and pulled over carefully, her hands already feeling shaky. She'd heard too many stories from friends and family about traffic stops gone wrong. "It's fine," she whispered to herself, taking a deep breath. "Just be polite, stay calm." She turned down her radio playing quiet jazz, put both hands on the steering wheel where they could be easily seen, and waited. Officer Derek Benson took his time approaching her window, his flashlight beam sweeping across her backseat before landing directly in her eyes, temporarily blinding her. Jamila squinted against the harsh light but kept her hands visible. "License and registration," he demanded without greeting or explanation for the stop. His voice was hard, cold. "Good evening, officer," Jamila said, keeping her voice steady. "May I reach for my purse to get my license? It's in the passenger seat." Officer Benson didn't answer right away, just stared at her with narrowed eyes. His hand rested on his holster, a detail that sent a chill through Jamila's body. "Make it quick," he finally said. With slow, deliberate movements, Jamila reached for her purse and retrieved her wallet. She handed over her license and then carefully opened the glove compartment for her registration. Officer Benson snatched the documents from her hand. "What are you doing in this neighborhood at this hour?" Jamila blinked in confusion. "I live just 3 blocks from here, sir. I'm coming home from a community meeting." Benson's eyebrow raised as he checked her license. "This isn't the kind of car people around here usually drive." Her modest sedan was hardly flashy. It was 10 years old and reliable, nothing more. "I've lived here for 8 years, officer." "This is my neighborhood," Jamila explained, feeling her heart rate increase. There was something in his tone that felt dangerous. "You people always have excuses, don't you?" he muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. The words hung in the air between them. Jamila swallowed hard, knowing exactly what he meant by "you people." She'd heard it before, in stores when she was followed by security, at her children's school when she questioned a teacher's assessment, and now from a police officer who was supposed to protect and serve everyone equally. "I'm sorry, but may I ask when I was pulled over?" she asked, trying to keep her voice from shaking. Officer Benson's face hardened. "Your taillight is out." Jamila frowned. That was impossible. She had just had her car serviced last week, and everything was in working order, but she knew better than to argue. "Thank you for letting me know. I'll get it fixed first thing tomorrow." "Step out of the vehicle," Benson ordered suddenly. "Excuse me." Jamila's pulse quickened. "May I ask why?" "I said step out of the vehicle. Now." His hand moved to his belt again, this time resting on his baton instead of his gun. Across the street, a teenage girl named Tasha was walking her dog. She slowed down, watching the scene unfold with growing concern. Quietly, she pulled out her phone and began recording. Jamila carefully unbuckled her seatbelt. "I'm complying, officer. I'm opening my door now." As she stepped out, Officer Benson immediately grabbed her arm with unnecessary force, twisting it behind her back. "What are you doing?" "I'm not resisting." Jamila gasped, the pain shooting up her shoulder. "Stop resisting," Benson shouted, though she clearly wasn't. He slammed her against the side of her car, her cheek pressed against the cold metal. "Please," Jamila said, "my children are waiting for me at home." That's when Officer Benson did something that would change both their lives forever. With no provocation, he struck her across the face with enough force that her lips split open, blood trickling down her chin and onto her white blouse. What he didn't know was that Tasha's phone was capturing everything, the video already automatically uploading to her cloud storage. And what he couldn't possibly expect was that Jamila Washington, the quiet community organizer who always played by the rules, was about to become the catalyst for a fight he never saw coming. Jamila carefully opened her car door and stepped out, her movements slow and deliberate. The night had grown colder, or maybe it was just fear making her shiver. Officer Benson towered over her, his face half hidden in shadow, but she could see the tight line of his mouth, the cold look in his eyes. "Turn around and put your hands on the vehicle," he ordered. "Officer, I don't understand what's happening," Jamila said, her voice remarkably steady despite the panic rising in her chest. "I've done nothing wrong." "I said turn around." Benson's voice rose sharply. He grabbed her shoulder and spun her around roughly. Across the street, Tasha's fingers trembled as she continued recording. She was only 16, but she knew something wasn't right. Her dog, a small terrier mix, sensed her anxiety and stayed quiet at her feet. The streetlight above cast enough light for her phone to capture every detail of what was unfolding. "Spread your legs." "Wider," Benson commanded, kicking at Jamila's ankles to force her feet apart. "I'm going to search you." "You don't have the right," Jamila began, but her words were cut short when Benson grabbed her wrist, twisting it painfully behind her back. "I have every right when I suspect criminal activity," he hissed near her ear. "What criminal activity?" Jamila winced at the pain shooting up her arm. "I was just driving home." In one swift motion, Benson slammed her against the side of the car, hard enough that the impact knocked the breath from her lungs. Her cheek pressed against the cold metal of her car roof. "Stop resisting," he shouted, though anyone watching could see she wasn't fighting back at all. "I'm not resisting," Jamila gasped, trying to stay calm, trying to remember everything she ever read about surviving police encounters. Her children's faces flashed in her mind. They needed her to come home tonight. That's when it happened. As Jamila tried to turn her head to look at him, to plead her case, Officer Benson struck her across the face with an open hand. The sound of the slap echoed in the quiet street, followed by Jamila's cry of pain and shock. The force of the blow split her lip. Warm blood trickled down her chin, dripping onto her cream-colored blouse. The metallic taste filled her mouth as tears sprang to her eyes, not just from pain, but from humiliation and rage. Tasha had to clamp her hand over her mouth to keep from crying out. She zoomed in with her phone camera, making sure to capture Benson's face and badge number clearly visible in the streetlight. "You struck me," Jamila said in disbelief, her voice shaking now. "I wasn't doing anything." "Shut up," Benson growled, pulling handcuffs from his belt. "You're under arrest for resisting an officer and assaulting an officer." "Assaulting? I never touched you." Blood dripped from Jamila's lip as she spoke. "Tell it to the judge," Benson said, smirking slightly as he roughly cuffed her wrists. "Your word against mine." What Officer Benson didn't know was that it wouldn't be just her word against his. Across the street, Tasha had captured everything. Her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped her phone, but she kept recording as Benson shoved Jamila into the back of his patrol car. As soon as the police car pulled away, Tasha ran home, her dog scampering beside her. Her heart was pounding, her mind racing. She knew what she had just witnessed was wrong, terribly wrong. Her parents had taught her about the long history of police violence against black people in America, but seeing it happen right in front of her was different from any lesson or news story. Inside her house, Tasha's fingers flew over her phone. First, she saved the video to multiple places to make sure it couldn't be lost. Then, with a deep breath, she posted it to social media with a simple caption, "Just witnessed a police officer assault an innocent woman during a traffic stop. This has to stop. Please share." She tagged local news stations and several civil rights organizations. Within minutes, the first shares and comments began coming in. By midnight, the video had been viewed over 10,000 times. By morning, it would be hundreds of thousands. Miles away, in a cold holding cell at the police station, Jamila sat with dried blood on her face, wondering how she would explain to her children why she hadn't come home. She had no idea that a teenager with a phone had just become her most powerful ally, or that by morning, the entire city would know her name. The holding cell was cold and smelled of bleach and sweat. Jamila sat on the hard metal bench, her back against the concrete wall. The clock on the wall outside the cell read 2:17 a.m. She hadn't been allowed to make a phone call yet, and her mother would be worried sick about why she hadn't come home. Her lip had stopped bleeding, but it throbbed painfully. She could feel it swelling, along with the side of her face where it had connected with her car. There were 3 other women in the cell with her, one sleeping, one crying softly, and one staring blankly at the wall. None of them spoke. "Washington," a voice called out finally. A female officer stood at the cell door. You get your phone call now." Jamila's legs felt stiff as she stood up. She followed the officer down a brightly lit hallway to a wall-mounted phone. Her fingers trembled as she dialed her mother's number. "Mom," she said when her mother's panicked voice answered. "I'm okay. I'm at the police station. They arrested me during a traffic stop." She fought to keep her voice steady. "Can you stay with the kids? I don't know when they'll let me out." "What happened to you?" her mother asked, hearing the strain in Jamila's voice. "I'll explain everything later. Just tell the kids I had to work late and I'll be home soon." She couldn't bear the thought of her children knowing where she really was right now. After the call, the female officer led her to a small room where her mugshot was taken, her fingerprints recorded. The flash of the camera made her squint, and she wondered how bad her face looked with the swollen lip and bruised cheek. The officers processing her paperwork barely looked at her, as if she were just another routine case, another body to process through the system. "Charges assaulting an officer and resisting arrest," one said to another, typing into a computer. "I didn't assault anyone," Jamila said quietly. "The officer hit me." The typing stopped for just a moment, then continued. Neither officer replied. Back in the cell, Jamila closed her eyes, trying to rest, but her mind raced. Would she lose her job? Would her neighbors look at her differently? How would she explain this to her children? The weight of these questions pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Meanwhile, across town, Tasha couldn't sleep either. After posting the video, she'd woken her parents and shown them what she'd witnessed. Her father, a high school history teacher, had immediately called a friend who worked at the local news station. "This is exactly why we got you that phone," her mother said, hugging her tightly. "You did the right thing." By 6 a.m., Tasha's video had been shared over 50,000 times. It had been picked up by 3 local news stations and was beginning to appear on national news sites. The hashtag Justice for Jamila was trending in their city. At 7 a.m., a small group of protesters had already gathered outside the police precinct where Jamila was being held. By 8 a.m., that group had grown to over 100 people. They carried hastily made signs. "Black Lives Matter," "Stop Police Brutality," "Release Jamila Now." Inside the precinct, officers were growing tense as the crowd outside grew louder. The police chief arrived earlier than usual, rushing past the holding cells toward his office. Conversations between officers were hushed urgent. Something was happening. Jamila noticed the change in atmosphere but didn't understand what was causing it. She hadn't slept at all and was fighting to keep her eyes open when a different officer approached her cell. "Washington, come with me," he said, unlocking the door. "Am I being released?" she asked, standing up stiffly. "The district attorney wants to talk to you," was all he said. He led her to a conference room where a woman in a gray suit sat at the table with a folder open in front of her. The officer left them alone, closing the door behind him. "Ms. Washington, I'm District Attorney Chen," the woman said, looking up from the folder. Her expression was unreadable. "Please have a seat." Jamila sat down, her heart pounding. Was this good news or bad? "A video has surfaced of your arrest last night," Chen said, her voice carefully neutral. "I've reviewed it several times." Jamila's eyes widened. "A video?" She hadn't seen anyone filming. "There's a significant crowd gathered outside this building right now," Chen continued. "Your case has gained considerable attention overnight." Through the window of the conference room, Jamila could hear the faint chanting from outside. For the first time since the handcuffs had been placed on her wrists, she felt a small flicker of hope. "The charges against you are being dropped," Chen said, closing the folder. "You're free to go." Relief washed over Jamila, but it was quickly replaced by anger. "That's it? What about the officer who assaulted me?" Chen's expression tightened. "That's being investigated separately." "Investigated," Jamila repeated. The word felt hollow, meaningless. How many investigations had she heard about that led nowhere? As Jamila walked out of the police station 20 minutes later, she was stunned to see the crowd of supporters. Signs with her name, people chanting for justice. And at the front of the crowd stood a teenage girl with her parents, the girl who had captured everything on video, who had made sure the truth couldn't be buried or denied. Their eyes met across the crowd, and in that moment, something shifted inside Jamila. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The first thing Jamila did when she got home was hug her children. They ran to her at the door, wrapping their small arms around her waist, their faces bright with relief. Her son, only 8 years old, noticed her swollen lip immediately. "Mommy, what happened to your face?" he asked, his eyes wide with concern. Jamila exchanged a look with her mother over the children's heads. "I had a little accident," she said gently, "but I'm okay now." After getting the children settled with breakfast, her mother pulled her aside in the kitchen. "Tell me everything," she demanded in a whisper, her face lined with worry. "The news is saying a police officer hit you?" Jamila sank into a chair at the kitchen table, suddenly exhausted. "He did, Mom. He pulled me over for no reason, got aggressive, and then—" she touched her lip gingerly. "I never thought this would happen to me." Her mother's eyes filled with tears. "I always worried something like this could happen, ever since you were a little girl. It's why I taught you to be so careful around police." The doorbell rang, interrupting their conversation. Jamila opened it to find a tall woman in a crisp suit standing on her porch. "Ms. Washington, I'm Lisa Thompson from Thompson Legal Group. I specialize in civil rights cases." She handed Jamila a business card. "May I come in? I believe I can help you." Jamila hesitated, then stepped aside to let her in. They sat in the living room, speaking in low voices while the children played in their room, and Jamila's mother kept watch from the kitchen doorway. "I've seen the video," Lisa said. "It's clear evidence of police misconduct. The officer had no right to treat you that way. You have a strong case, not just against him, but against the department that employed him." "I just want to put this behind me," Jamila said, rubbing her temples. "I have 2 kids, a job. I can't afford to fight the entire police department." Lisa leaned forward. "That's exactly what they're counting on. People like Officer Benson get away with this behavior because victims are too afraid or too busy to fight back." She paused. "The young woman who recorded the video, Tasha Wilson, has reached out to me. She's willing to testify. There are also records of previous complaints against Benson." Jamila looked up sharply. "Previous complaints? 3 in the last 2 years, all filed by people of color, all dismissed during internal investigations." Liz's expression was grim. "This is a pattern, Ms. Washington, not an isolated incident." From the kitchen, Jamila's mother spoke up. "You need to fight this, baby. If not for yourself, then for your kids, so they don't grow up in a world where this keeps happening." Jamila closed her eyes, thinking of all the news stories she'd seen, all the hashtags, all the protests that seemed to change nothing. Could her case really be different? Her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from her friend Diane. "Just saw the news. The whole community center is behind you, whatever you need." Another text came in from her neighbor. "My church group is organizing a support rally. We're with you all the way." "People are willing to stand with you," Lisa said, noticing the messages. "You won't be fighting alone." Jamila walked to the window and looked out at her neighborhood, the same streets where Officer Benson had claimed she didn't belong. This was her home. These were her people, and they were ready to stand with her. "What would fighting back even look like?" she asked, turning back to Lisa. "We file a civil lawsuit against Benson and the department. We press for criminal charges. We use the media attention to push for policy changes." Lisa counted off each point on her fingers. "But most importantly, we make sure your story is heard. We make it impossible for them to brush this under the rug." Jamila thought of her children in the next room. What kind of example would she set by walking away? What kind of world would they inherit if she didn't at least try to change things? Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a number she didn't recognize. "Ms. Washington, this is Tasha." The girl who recorded what happened. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry I couldn't help more that night. But I'm ready to help now. You're not alone." Something shifted inside Jamila in that moment. The fear and uncertainty didn't disappear, but alongside them grew something stronger. Determination. "Okay," she said finally, straightening her shoulders. "I'll do it. I'll fight back. Not just for me, but for everyone who's been through this and didn't have a video to prove it happened." Lisa nodded, a small smile forming. "They're not expecting you to fight. That's our advantage." "No," Jamila agreed, a new resolve hardening in her voice. "They're not expecting me to fight. and that's their mistake. 3 days after meeting with Lisa, Jamila sat at her kitchen table surrounded by papers. News articles about police misconduct, printouts of similar cases, and most importantly, documents about Officer Benson that Lisa's team had obtained through public records requests. "Look at this," Lisa said, pushing a paper toward Jamila. Officer Benson had 3 formal complaints filed against him in the last 18 months, all by Black or Hispanic drivers. Jamila scanned the document, her stomach tightening, and nothing happened with any of them. The department ruled them all unfounded or not sustained. No discipline, not even a note in his file. Lisa's voice was tight with anger. But there's a pattern here that's impossible to ignore. Jamila's phone buzzed with a text from Tasha. "Channel 5 wants to interview me about the video. Is that okay with you?" Since the night of the incident, Tasha had become not just a witness but a friend. The teenager had a fierce sense of justice that reminded Jamila of herself at that age, before life had taught her to be cautious. "Tell her yes," Lisa advised when Jamila showed her the message. "The more media attention we get, the harder it will be for the department to sweep this under the rug." That evening, Jamila watched Tasha's interview from her living room couch, her children tucked against her sides. The girl spoke clearly and confidently, describing exactly what she'd seen. "I was walking my dog when I saw the police car with its lights on," Tasha explained to the reporter. "At first I didn't think much of it, but then I heard the officer yelling. Something felt wrong, so I started recording." The station didn't show the most violent part of the video, but they described what happened. When the reporter asked Tasha why she decided to record, her answer made Jamila's eyes fill with tears. "My parents always taught me that sometimes the truth needs witnesses," Tasha said simply. "I wanted to be a witness for Ms. Washington because I knew she needed one." The following morning, Lisa called with news. "The department has placed Benson on administrative leave pending investigation," she said. "It's just a first step, but it's something." "Administrative leave?" Jamila repeated. "So he's getting a paid vacation while they investigate?" "For now," Lisa confirmed. But the district attorney's office has requested all the bodycam footage and patrol car videos. And here's the interesting part. Benson reported his bodycam malfunctioned that night. "Convenient," Jamila said bitterly. "Very. But patrol cars have cameras too. If his bodycam mysteriously failed, let's see what excuse they have for the patrol car footage." 2 days later, Jamila received a call from a local community organizer named Ray, who she knew from her work at the community center. "We're planning a rally at City Hall tomorrow," he told her, demanding the department release all footage and fire Benson. "Will you speak?" The thought made Jamila's heart race. Public speaking wasn't her thing, and the idea of standing in front of a crowd, talking about that night, made her feel exposed, vulnerable. "I don't know," she hesitated. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that." "Just think about it," Ray said. "Your voice would mean a lot, but no pressure, I promise." That night, as Jamila tucked her daughter into bed, the 8-year-old looked up at her with serious eyes. "Tommy at school said his dad saw you on the news. He said a police officer was mean to you." Jamila sat on the edge of the bed, choosing her words carefully. "Yes, that's true. A police officer did something wrong, and now I'm working with some people to make sure he doesn't do it again." "Like a superhero?" her daughter asked. Jamila smiled despite herself. "Not exactly. More like someone who stands up when something isn't right." "I want to be like that too," her daughter said sleepily. "Someone who stands up." The next day, Jamila found herself on the steps of City Hall, looking out at a crowd of over 200 people. Signs bobbed above their heads: "Justice for Jamila," "Fire Benson now," "Police Accountability Matters." Lisa stood beside her, along with Ray and several other community leaders. Tasha and her parents were in the front row, smiling encouragement. When it was Jamila's turn to speak, she stepped up to the microphone with shaking hands but a steady voice. "My name is Jamila Washington," she began. "1 week ago, I was driving home from a community meeting when Officer Derek Benson pulled me over for no valid reason. He'd assaulted me, arrested me on false charges, and thought that would be the end of it." She paused, looking out at the faces watching her. He was wrong. A cheer went up from the crowd, giving her courage to continue. "What happened to me isn't unique. It happens every day, in every city across this country. The difference is that this time there was a witness. This time there was a video. This time we have proof. She pointed to the police headquarters visible down the street. And this time we're not going to stop until there are real consequences and real change. As the crowd erupted in applause, a news van pulled up at the edge of the gathering. The local reporter looked grim as she approached Lisa and whispered something in her ear. Lisa's expression changed from confusion to shock. She turned to Jamila as the crowd continued chanting behind them. "They just found the patrol car footage," Lisa said, "and you're not going to believe what's on it." The patrol car footage changed everything. Lisa and Jamila sat in the district attorney's office, watching the video on a large monitor. Unlike Tasha's recording, which started in the middle of the encounter, this footage captured the entire traffic stop from beginning to end. The most stunning part wasn't just Benson striking Jamila, it was what happened before and after. The camera had picked up Benson's voice as he called in the license plate before pulling her over. "Got a nice car in the wrong neighborhood," he said to dispatch. "Probably stolen, running the plates now." When dispatch came back, confirming the car belonged to Jamila and was registered to her address just blocks away, Benson laughed. "Well, let's find another reason then." District Attorney Chen's face remained impassive as they watched, but her knuckles were white where she gripped her pen. After Benson had handcuffed Jamila and put her in the back seat, the camera recorded him talking to another officer who arrived as backup. "These people need to learn their place," Benson said, gesturing toward Jamila in the back of his patrol car. "She got mouthy, so I had to teach her some respect." The backup officer looked uncomfortable but said nothing. When the video ended, the room fell silent. Finally, DA Chen spoke. "Ms. Washington, I owe you an apology on behalf of this office. We should have reviewed this footage before making any decisions about your case." She turned to face Jamila directly. "I'm filing charges against Officer Benson today. Assault under color of authority, filing a false police report, and civil rights violations." "Will it stick?" Lisa asked bluntly. "With this evidence? Yes." Chen's voice was firm. "I've already spoken with the police chief. Benson's administrative leave has been changed to suspension without pay, effective immediately." On the drive home, Jamila felt strangely hollow. The vindication she'd expected to feel was there, but mixed with it was a deep sadness. "It shouldn't take a miracle to get justice," she said quietly to Lisa. "Two different videos, a witness, and still they'd almost got away with it." "That's why what you're doing matters," Lisa replied. "This isn't just about Benson anymore. It's about changing the system." Over the next few weeks, Jamila channeled her energy into doing exactly that. She spoke at community meetings, city council sessions, and police oversight hearings. She collaborated with local activists who had been fighting for police reform for years. "You have something many victims don't," Ray told her after one particularly powerful speech. "You have proof, you have a platform, and you have people listening. We can't waste that." Jamila didn't waste it. She worked with Lisa to draft a proposal for the city council. All officers would have working body cameras at all times while on duty, with serious consequences for malfunctions. Civilian complaints would be reviewed by an independent board, not just internal affairs. And officers with multiple complaints would face real scrutiny, not protection. The police union fought back hard. They called Jamila's case an isolated incident. They accused her of being anti-police. Some officers even drove slowly past her house, an intimidation tactic that scared her children but only strengthened her resolve. "They think they can wait us out," she told Lisa after a particularly discouraging city council meeting where the vote on their proposals was delayed again. "They think we'll get tired and go away. Then we'll prove them wrong," Lisa replied simply. That night, Jamila couldn't sleep. She sat on her front porch, wrapped in a blanket despite the mild weather, thinking about how her life had changed in just a few weeks. Before Benson pulled her over, she'd been focused on her children, her job, her small corner of the world. Now she was speaking in front of crowds, giving interviews, fighting a system that had seemed untouchable. Her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Tasha. "Just wanted to see how you're doing. Sending you strength for tomorrow." Tomorrow was Benson's arraignment. Jamila would have to see him in person for the first time since that night. The thought made her stomach knot with anxiety. As if sensing her mood, Another text came through. This one was from Ray. Just heard from my contact at City Hall. The police chief is feeling the pressure. Word is he's going to support at least part of our proposal to show good faith. We're getting through to them. Jamila smiled faintly in the darkness. It wasn't everything they wanted, but it was something. A crack in the wall. A car slowed down as it passed her house. Jamila tensed, then relaxed as she recognized her neighbor's sit-in. The neighbor waved, then pulled into the driveway across the street. Can't sleep either. Her neighbor called softly. Too much on my mind, Jamila replied. We're proud of you, you know, the woman said. Everyone on this block. What you're doing takes courage. As her neighbor went inside, Jamila looked up at the stars, barely visible through the city lights. She thought about her children sleeping inside, about Tasha and her fierce belief in justice, about all the people who had been hurt like she was but didn't have a video to prove it. I'm not stopping, she whispered to the night. Not until something changes. Not until it's better for all of us. 6 months after that fateful night, Jamila stood on the steps of City Hall once again. This time she wasn't part of a protest. She was there at the invitation of the mayor, alongside Lisa, Tasha, Ray, and dozens of community members who had become friends and allies in her fight. Behind them, the city council chambers were packed for the official signing of what the local paper had dubbed the Washington Act, a comprehensive police reform bill that would change how the department operated. Body cameras that couldn't be turned off during encounters with the public. An independent civilian review board with actual power to discipline officers. Mandatory bias training, and most importantly, a transparent system for tracking and investigating complaints against officers. I never wanted to be the face of this movement, Jamila said quietly to Lisa as they waited for the ceremony to begin. I just wanted to go home to my kids that night. Sometimes we don't choose our battles, Lisa replied, squeezing her hand. They choose us, and you rose to it beautifully. The journey to this moment had been far from easy. Officer Benson had initially pleaded not guilty to all charges, forcing Jamila to relive that night through testimony and cross-examination. The defense attorney had tried to paint her as anti-police, as someone with a grudge, as someone who had somehow provoked the assault. But the videos, both Tasha's and the patrol car footage, spoke for themselves. 3 weeks into the trial, facing overwhelming evidence and a jury that was clearly not sympathetic, Benson changed his plea to guilty in exchange for a slightly reduced sentence. He would serve jail time, not as much as Jamila thought he deserved, but enough to send a message. More importantly, he would never work in law enforcement again. I've had enough of hearings and courtrooms to last a lifetime, Jamila had told her mother when it was over. But she knew her work wasn't done. Justice for one officer wasn't enough if the system remained unchanged. Now, as the mayor approached the podium to begin the ceremony, Jamila spotted her children in the front row, sitting with her mother. Her son waved excitedly, and her daughter held up a hand-drawn sign, "My mom is a hero." Today marks a new chapter for our city, the mayor began. One where accountability and trust between police and the communities they serve becomes our highest priority. As the mayor spoke, Jamila thought about the countless hours of meetings, the late nights drafting proposals, the moments of doubt when it seemed like nothing would change. She thought about the other victims who had reached out to her, some with stories far worse than hers, who had never gotten justice. She thought about her children and the world they would inherit. The mayor gestured for her to join him at the podium. As Jamila stepped forward, the crowd erupted in applause. She waited for it to quiet down before speaking. 6 months ago, I was just a mother and community organizer trying to get home to my children, she began, her voice strong and clear. Today, I stand before you as living proof that one person can make a difference, but also as living proof that none of us can do it alone. She gestured to those standing with her, Lisa, Tasha, Ray, and the others who had fought alongside her. This victory belongs to all of us. To everyone who shared their stories, who showed up at protests, who called their council members, who refused to accept that this is just how things are. She paused, looking at her children. And it belongs to the next generation, who will grow up in a city where they can trust those sworn to protect them. After the ceremony, as people mingled and celebrated, Tasha approached Jamila with a small gift bag. I made this for you, she said shyly, handing it over. Inside was a framed photograph of Jamila speaking at the first rally, her face determined and strong despite her still healing lip. Across the bottom, Tasha had written a quote, "Never forget that justice is what love looks like in public." Tears sprang to Jamila's eyes as she hugged the teenager who had become like family to her. "Thank you for being brave enough to record that night," she whispered. "You changed everything." "No," Tasha replied firmly. "You did. I just captured it." Later that evening, as Jamila tucked her children into bed, her daughter asked a question that made her pause. "Mummy, are the police good now? Will they be nice to us?" Jamila sat on the edge of the bed, searching for the right words. "The police are people, sweetheart. Some are good, some make mistakes, and some need to learn to be better. What we did today was make sure that the good ones have better rules to follow, and the ones who make mistakes have to answer for them." "Like Officer Benson," her son said sleepily. "Yes, like him." Jamila smoothed his hair. "But more importantly, we made sure that people know they can speak up when something's wrong. That's the real change." As her children drifted off to sleep, Jamila stood by the window looking out at her neighborhood, the same streets where Benson had claimed she didn't belong. A sense of peace settled over her for the first time in months. The fight wasn't over, it never would be completely. But tonight, in this moment, she had shown her children and her community that justice was possible. That one voice, joined by others, could echo loudly enough to shake the foundations of power. That fighting back wasn't just about anger, it was about love for each other and hope for a better world.